Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back bringing you part two of my review of Saints and Sinners from the Rippaverse. We're going to look at the middle two stories in this 6-story short collection today. And if you want my brief thumbnail overview of what I think of the book as a whole, I think it's going to be very much to taste. This is 6 short stories, each about 15 pages, and that doesn't give you a ton of room to unpack a scenario, characters. They're very short and punchy, and they're not necessarily the most satisfying stories, although they do ask a lot of interesting questions. And if you like more questions than answers, I think you will enjoy Saints and Sinners as an anthology. But if you're looking for really satisfying character arcs or, deep explorations of the world or development on a plot idea, well, short stories, they're just not going to do that in any format, but especially in comics. It's such a condensed medium to start with. It's difficult to do a whole lot in just a couple of pages. So we have 2 stories here, and both of these stories are very heavily about mystery. You could say every story in this book is about mystery, but these 2, I think, have the strongest sub-themes of mystery, even though, as I discussed in my previous video, Chasing Ghosts is a detective story in genre. The mystery there is less about what is going on and more about what Ingrid is going to do, I think. Because the story doesn't actually answer many of the questions about the mysteries it presents. So in these 2 stories, we have 2 different kinds of mysteries presented to us. One is a mystery about people, and the other is a mystery about a place. And both of them don't really answer a whole lot of the questions that they pose. But one of them manages to be fairly satisfying, and I found the other to be pretty unsatisfying. Let's talk a little bit about these 2 stories, and I'll explain what my issues with them are. So the first story is The Weight of Restraint by Eric July. And this story is pretty much broken down into 3 sections. The first is an introduction, which takes place in a prison yard. We see 2 of the inmates fighting. One of them has a knife, and the other one is unarmed. And yet the unarmed prisoner manages to pretty handily avoid any danger from the armed prisoner. This goes on for a little bit until the guards come in and break up the fight. Not much really happens there. The big thing is we see the unarmed prisoner have an opportunity to hit his attacker, and he hesitates. That's pretty much all we get in that scene. Obviously, as the title of the story somewhat suggests, the unarmed prisoner is a very restrained person. He does not speak. He doesn't, he's not aggressive even after he's been attacked. He stops himself the one opportunity he has to hit back. We get a little bit of a sense of his character, but it turns out that the prisoner is not our main character, which makes a lot of that characterization kind of difficult to place in the rest of the narrative. The main character is actually a man named Jackson Canehart, and he seems to be a member of kind of Innocence Project kind of program. He's some sort of lawyer or perhaps a law enforcement officer of some kind. And his job seems to be to review case files to make sure everything went the way it should, particularly convictions, if I'm reading everything correctly. And one of the case files he finds, I presume, has to do with this prisoner, because we eventually, he figures out the man's name and discovers that a prisoner is named Samford Willard. And the process of that is pretty much the entirety of the story. It sure sounds like Jackson is dealing with a corrupt department that isn't actually interested in investigating these cases. And there's some, I can't comment too much on the investigation part of this. A lot of it seems to be interested with cybersecurity or things like that. I'm no expert on that. When I deal with technology, it's at a much more granular level. I'm a commercial printer, so I deal with networks and image files and stuff like that. But there's a lot of talk about metadata and backups and stuff like that that I'm not really qualified to comment on. I imagine that I would find it just as silly as I find some of the other things I've read about in fiction. But that's okay. Fiction often has a very surface level approach to these kind of things. So it doesn't bother me a whole lot. What does bother me is we are presented with two characters. We don't learn a whole lot about them other than that Jackson Caneford is a well-intentioned lawyer or law enforcement officer, if that's what he is. But he is well-intentioned. He is interested in actually providing justice for people like Sanford. And that speaks well to him. But it's difficult to figure out what exactly the stakes in the story are. Obviously, there is a man in jail, and something about his case seems to be being covered up. We don't know what that is. Is he an innocent man in jail? Or does he see being in jail as some kind of check on his own bad behavior? Clearly, this is a man who values restraint. Sanford is. I really don't know what the conflict for Sanford is supposed to be. And I don't understand what the cover-up is. And there's a famous Alfred Hitchcock quote about two people eating dinner at a restaurant with a bomb under the table. If the audience doesn't know the bomb is there, there's no suspense, there's no stakes. You don't know that something can go wrong. Well, if the audience does know that the bomb is there, then there is immediately stakes. I don't know what the deal with Sanford is, and that makes it very difficult to get invested in his story because there's such ill-defined stakes in the entire story. I think there's some interesting potential character dynamics between Jackson and his supervisor on the project. All in all, it was hard to get invested in the story because I wasn't sure what was going on. So the story itself was a bit of a miss. The art in the story was done by Elias Martins and colors by Diego Albuquerque. They do a fine job. I think Martin in particular has a strong command of expression. He has very emotive faces, which is something I find lacking in a lot of comic book artists. But he has a way of showing both subtle expressions like pensive thought or, that moment of hesitation. Sanford prevents himself from hitting his attacker. Or the way Sanford kind of has a almost disgusted look when he's initially attacked. Like all of this is beneath him. It speaks a lot to the internal life of his characters. That is something that can be very difficult to do. So I praise Diego for that. He has a strong sense of those elements. The coloring is fine. Nothing really to write home about there, but oftentimes coloring is just there to, give a little more depth to the art. And it really shouldn't be front and center. So I think, I'm sorry, Elias is the internal artist. Diego is the colorist. So I think Diego did a certainly workable job there. And, the story is visually fine. It's just, it lacks stakes. It really lacks a sense of drive. I'm not sure what we're getting at here. Because again, I'm not even sure that Sam is innocent. And so, are we trying to prove he's innocent? Are we trying to just reveal the cover up? What's being covered up? It's very hard to get invested in any of those questions. The second story I want to talk about is Bone God by Callum Edmonds, better known on the internet as Mauler. The guy who has made an entire career off raging at The Last Jedi. To be fair, talked about a lot of other things too. I've been watching EFAP since the single digits, I believe. So clearly, I enjoy his commentary on story, and I was interested to see what he would do with a story here. As I mentioned before, I got the Bone God cover because it's got people exploring exotic locations in cramped quarters underground, and I enjoy that kind of thing. Um, I was very predisposed to like this story, and I think it has a lot going for it. One thing that this mystery has that we didn't really see in Weight of Restraint is we immediately get a sense of what we're here for. Our protagonist, well, the most important character in this story is Adam, and he has discovered a lost temple. Um, Adam Vanusus, I believe, is how that's pronounced. I'm gonna call him Adam. Adam is a old guy got two kids. He's there with his ex-wife, and he's got a couple of adventurers along with him, Maps and Mr. Graves. These are very archetypical characters. We have our wealthy dabbler who is here to do some archaeology in the old-fashioned way with dynamite and pickaxes. He's got bickering kids. One of them is interested in currying favor with dad. I'm not sure if he's currying favor with dad or if he's just the one who values his father's good opinion. It's hard to tell. We don't get a whole lot of time with any of these characters, which may be my biggest issue with the story. It feels like there was a lot left on the table in this story, unfortunately. Part of that is, again, the constraints of the medium. So there's a mama's boy who argues with everyone, including his mama. It's obvious which one he takes after. And then you have your explorers. So it's a bunch of very recognizable character types, which is good. We don't have a whole lot of time to get to know them. And everybody kind of generally understands the idea of exploring underground place. I think this story is pretty solid. The events all kind of flow from one to the other. There is a couple of things I would have liked to see executed on better. That's as much to do with the art direction, I think, as the writing. And that is largely the Graves sees a number of hallucinations as he goes through the tomb. And two of them seem fairly intuitive. The first happens right after they dynamite a wall, and he sees a figure that seems to be made of smoke in the distance. The third one is just a ghoulish, goblinish kind of creature looming up out of the dark. Both of those seem fairly intuitive. One of them is he sees something strange in the smoke and dust. And another one is potentially his eyes playing tricks on him in the dark. However, there is a hallucination or a vision or a specter in between those two. We go straight from some dialogue between Adam and his ex-wife to Graves seeing the specter. I'm not really sure what prompted it there. Oddly enough, when you see a monster looming up out of the dark, that is intuitive how that comes about. However, this specter here in the middle seems to be another appearance of one of these misty, smoky specters, and there's no prompting for it. They haven't dynamited another wall. There's no dust in the air in any of the preceding panels. I'm not really sure what prompted that, and I would have liked to see some indication of what was going on there. This would also give it more of a sense of escalation. Like the first time, you have this big explosion of dust, and Graves thinks he sees, oh, there's something there. And then the second time, maybe, there's somebody jostles a wall and a bunch of rocks fall. And in the third one, so maybe he sees some dust from the rocks that prompts the second vision. And then the third one, you can just have a monster appear from nowhere. because we see in that an escalation. Whatever Graves is seeing is getting more and more powerful or insistent. So I would have liked a slightly stronger thread of connection there. Um, there's also some of the Ripperverse layout issues in this story, and if you're excited about us potentially looking at some panels in autistic detail, here we go. This is early in the story, and I've left the text on this panel because I think it's relevant. We have a lot of text in the panel. And that's actually true of many panels in the story. Bone God has a lot of story to tell very quickly, and a lot of it is done through fairly naturalistic dialogue, which I appreciate. But sometimes that dialogue is not always easy to get through, and this is a good example of that. So we've got a total of 4 different people speaking in this panel. The first person is Maps, and he says, incredible, so many languages. I see breach, power, sacred, lord, walls, blood. And then the ex-wife says, we all see walls, you idiot. And right away, we have an issue here in the layout. We can't really tell who is talking because Maps' dialogue could very easily come from Adam. In fact, Adam is doing much the same thing that Maps is doing in this very panel. He's saying these are ritualistic carvings, respect to the temple and its functions are still intact. So he's also commenting on the walls. That's almost interchangeable dialogue. If you were to flip-flop it, it wouldn't be terribly unintuitive. In fact, we see Adam doing this kind of translation work later in the story. So we know that he can interpret just as well as Maps can. So having to go all the way down the middle of the panel, this is a lot of real estate. And then again, we have the ex-wife saying, we all see walls, you idiot. That line could very easily come from her son, Winford, who is also abrasive and not terribly impressed with Maps or Graves. So we have to figure out who's talking in this panel. And when you have to travel all this way down to see who the tails are pointing at, and then all the way back up to the next, it wastes a lot of time and it can break the flow of dialogue. And there's no need for this dialogue to be in a particular order. I understand kind of why the dialogue is laid out like this, because it does give you a very natural pattern to read through the page. It does kind of lead the eye, which is, again, something I am a bit of a stickler for, but it breaks the flow of the panel to have to go all the way down to these people. You actually are being led around in loops that don't get you a whole lot. So I've circled in green a spot where you could pull this dialogue down to, and you just put it there, and it would sit there. It's not necessary to understand any of the rest of the dialogue of the page. This all looks like stuff people are just saying as they're walking around. So you could just move that down there. It would read much better. There's nothing really important about these grates. I mean, it's a neat detail that they're there. Maybe they keep water from building up in the room, but we don't need to see both of them. You can put the dialogue over that. So these kind of layout details would really make the pages easier to read, and it might let you save some space. I don't know, how many notes they had to give the artists on this, but you could then bump the page up a little bit, and I don't know. You would probably have to go back to the page at the thumbnailing stage to do that. What's interesting here is that we don't actually have to look all the way down at Graves to figure out his dialogue, because he's the only one with a scanner. So when he talks about structural readings and then comments on the architecture, well, that's what he was doing on the last page when it was much more obvious that he was speaking. So we can connect that dialogue, this dialogue on the last page. It would have been nice if we could have had that kind of strength of dialogue in every speech bubble. Obviously, it's extremely difficult to do that. Part of the problem here is that there is a little bit of overlap in archetypes here, specifically between Adam's ex-wife, unfortunately I've forgotten her name, and Wyndham. Adam has 2 sons here, in fact, and That leads to another strange issue. At first, I thought Wyndham called Adam father and William called Adam dad. Uh, but that's not the case. And the opening splash page, it looks like William is saying, "Let's make history, father," instead of saying, "Let's make history, dad," which he addresses Adam as dad for most of the story. Then at the very end, there's some dialogue over a black panel where one of the two boys calls him dad and the other one calls him father, and I don't know which is which. And the dialogue is not clear enough to make that clear just from the way they're speaking. So not all the dialogue in this story is executed on with the kind of clarity that we see from Graves right here in his dialogue. And it would be nice if we could have that on every page. I mean, that should be a goal for every author every time. I'm not surprised when authors don't hit that mark. It's a very, very, very high bar to clear. But especially in this kind of a story where everything is cluttered, it's close, it's not always clear who's talking, especially if you're going to have dialogue over blank panels or blank pages. That kind of thing really needs to be focused and dialed in on. I don't think it is quite as well as it could have been with another pass or two with a good editor. So something else to see here that I marked on this page is this guy in the bottom left-hand corner. There are 6 named characters in this story, but they are on an expedition somewhere in the jungle, so they brought Sherpas with them to carry all their stuff, their dynamite, to pickaxe things when they need things pickaxed. Very important, for this kind of pseudo-archaeological expedition, to be sure. My problem is these characters just keep creeping into the edge of panels, and it's sometimes confusing, and sometimes I just... Let me show you something else here. This is another panel. I've taken the dialogue out because it's not important. What's important is that there's a guy in the bottom left-hand corner of it again, and these guys keep creeping into the corners of panels or the background of panels. I'm like, what are they there for? They clutter up the scenes. They don't really add a whole lot to the story one way or another. When this guy showed up in the second panel, I thought he might actually be kind of like a traitor in the group or somebody under the control of the Bone God, like a local who has heard the legends or something like that. But no, he's just there. He's just there. And it's strange. And this one, I think, is a little bit on Edmund's. I think he should have written the Sherpas out of the story fairly early. Not only is this a bit of a horror story, and having some expendable characters die early in the narrative, not only does it help build some tension, but it would just get them out of the way. Because a lot of the times they're taking up page real estate. There's not a lot of page real estate in this story, and they're distracting. They look like they're going to do something in the story, and ultimately they never do. I would have liked to see these guys go the way of the dodo much sooner than they do. And they do eventually. I probably not giving a whole lot away there. It is a horror story, as the name Bone God implies. And that means there's going to be some casualties along the way. There's a lot of casualties along the way. All in all, though, Bone God has stakes. Adam is there to get immortality. And, well, maybe he finds it, maybe he doesn't. Graves is there to get a job done. And maybe he gets that job done, maybe he doesn't. But I understand what they are after. I understand why they are making decisions and what's going to happen to them if those decisions screw up. And even though I don't know a lot about the Bone God, I understand that it is extremely dangerous. And I understand that Adam's probably either not going to get immortality from it, not going to get it in a way he likes. And it's clear that the Bone God is very dangerous to society at large if it somehow gets out of this place kept. All of that is conveyed to you very clearly by the narrative. And these are questions that are very interesting and fun to think about, even though there are some extraneous details in there that I think could have been cleaned up better. Bone God is a fun, grisly romp through a strange environment that I found to be pretty entertaining. I would like to see more of the characters that are still around to do more. And I think expanding on the lore of the Bone God could be a lot of fun if Edmunds ever gets a chance to do that. So, all in all, I think that by giving us just enough information about what's going on to enjoy the mystery, Edmunds succeeds in building this kind of mysterious narrative, much more so than July does in The Weight of Restraint. So, I don't know, maybe for you, a question of whether a man is guilty of something or not and what he's guilty of is intriguing. But the potential hazards of seeking immortality seems like a much better defined mystery to explore, at least to me. And I think that Bone God is probably, in terms of its scope and the questions it is asking, the best story in this anthology. I enjoyed reading it, and like all good stories, I think I was better equipped to understand the story on a reread. It is a story that rewards examination, as I think particularly Across to Bear by J. David, I discussed in the previous part of this review, also becomes a story more rewarding on a reread. That is a difficult thing to get as well. Edmund's not written a whole lot before. I know he's doing a short film with Will Jordan, the Critical Drinker, and having read his first foray into comics, I am looking forward to seeing that as well. Hopefully he gets a chance to write again. I found it fascinating, and I do hope he finds an opportunity to flex his affection for long-form content in the future, because Bone God has a lot of interesting stuff in it, but I think, it would have benefited from being unpacked a little bit more. Because we're only with these characters for 16 pages, give or take. Anyway, those are my thoughts on those two stories. Again, the collection as a whole is a smorgasbord of flavors, and whether any of them will be to your taste is up to you. But hopefully, this review has given you a little bit better idea whether the taste that this anthology presents are good tastes. That's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think of these stories down in the comments below. The like button and a subscribe button down there, you can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.